So now that we know the importance of seeds, kind of the benefits, we'll look at plants that don't have flowers, and then we'll look at plants that do. So the gymnosperms, they have vascular tissue, they have seeds, but they don't produce flowers. It's composed of 4 groups. We have conifers, cycads, cnidophytes, and ginkgos. There's actually only one species representing ginkgos today, and they thought ginkgos had gone extinct until they found just one tree, and every tree has been propagated, or I guess one garden containing trees, and every living ginkgo now has been propagated from that one garden. And the ginkgo tree has a separate male and female tree, and this is a female tree, and it produces these seeds which have just kind of a coating layer on the outside, so not technically a fruit, it's a different layer of tissue, but basically a coating on the outside. And if you ever plant a ginkgo tree, always ask if your tree is a male or a female. And I would strongly suggest that you only plant male trees in your yard, because the female, once she produces her seeds, it's going to be coated with this layer of tissue, and when that drops to the ground, and if that layer of tissue starts rotting away, it smells awful. I have heard that it smells like vomit, that it smells like rotting meat. I really don't know what it smells like, because I've never been near a female ginkgo tree that is dropping her seeds. So just check and make sure that you're planting males, or clean up very thoroughly, or your yard may smell like something ranging from vomit to rotting carcasses. Other things, cycads here, they were the predominant plant life when dinosaurs were prevalent. So dinosaurs primarily ate cycads, and they're not very common today. If you ever go to the botanical gardens in Des Moines, they have some very nice cycad specimens, and they're really interesting to look at. They have kind of very thick, tough leaves, and you just don't find them in Iowa unless you're going to a botanical garden. A little bit more about our gymnosperms. When they spread their pollen, or they pollinate, they use wind and water. So that's how they distribute their pollen. And because they're using wind and water, they're just relying on random chance that each grain of pollen might find a receptive plant that's a female. So because of that, gymnosperms produce an abundance of pollen, so more than they could possibly need, hoping that just some of those will find a female. This is why a lot of people have allergic reactions to gymnosperm pollen, just because they're producing so much of it. Also, in things like conifers, there are separate male cones and female cones, and you can easily see the difference. The male cones are only on the tree for one season, and they'll grow new ones in the next season, and they're very small and pretty fragile. If you grab this, it would just kind of flake apart in your hand. The female cone, they're the tough woody structures that we usually recognize as a pine cone. And the female cones stay on the tree for generally at least 3 years, sometimes much, much longer than that. So it takes about 3 years for that female cone to mature and also be fertilized. The life cycle has that haploid stage internally again that we've seen before, and that comes from the male cone producing pollen, and it lands on the female cones. The pollen will land in these ridges here, and this is in the first year that these cones are mature. They'll open up and have sap in between each of these, and that sap will catch the pollen and then dry, pulling the pollen in a little bit closer. However, fertilization might take an additional year. So if I use my artistic ability here to draw a pine cone, so this is my pine cone, and in the middle, right down the center here, we have our ovules with our eggs in there. The sap is going to land in these openings, or the pollen's going to land in these openings in the sap, and maybe get pulled up to the top of that. Then the pollen grows something called a pollen tube, which basically is a tube that grows through the tissue of the female plant until it reaches an ovule. Then it will produce sperm that swim through that tube, and fertilize the egg. So it can take a year for that pollen tube to grow. So it's been pollinated, but it might be another year before it's fertilized. So once fertilization occurs, then it will have the developing embryo growing inside of a seed. Some other characteristics of conifers: they are the tallest living organisms on Earth. Some examples would be the coast redwood. The tallest one ever measured and documented was 380 feet tall. So they're huge. These things were so big. In the past, they would, carve out a section in the middle of the tree, and people could drive cars through the center of the tree. They are also the oldest organisms on Earth. So the oldest whole tree, so entire tree, root to top, is 4,800 years old, and that is a bristlecone pine. And this is what the bristlecone pines look like that are the oldest. Now, these are actually growing on a steep side of a rocky mountain, and so they're kind of twisted and gnarled. These were part of a huge forest of these that were cut down by loggers. They didn't mess with these particular trees because they were on a steep slope and they were so gnarled and twisted, there wasn't any good lumber there. Anyway, but using tree cores, where you drill kind of a pencil-sized hole out of the tree and pull out that core, you can count the rings, and trees lay down a growth ring every year, so you can see each year that those trees have been living. And it's been found that the oldest tree is 4,800 years old, or has 4,800 tree rings. And the oldest roots are actually in a Norway spruce in Sweden, and those roots are 9,550 years old. Because what's happened is the top of the spruce has fallen over, the roots have survived and sent up a new tree. So the roots are actually older than the tree itself. So moving to whether they have flowers, and the plants that do have flowers, those are angiosperms. And angiosperms are a fairly recent development as far as plants go. They appeared in the fossil record around 135 million years ago, and they are now kind of the dominant plant life on the planet. So they've been very, very successful because of the characteristics of those flowers. So flowers work with pollinators. So the whole purpose of the flower is to transfer pollen from one plant to the next. So usually flowering plants don't use wind and water for pollinating. Instead, they're going to use insects that go between different flowers. So there is a strong coevolution between insects and flowers. And looking at these different adaptations here, they can use trickery. This is actually a flower at first glance. It looks kind of like an insect body, but that's a flower that's mimicking an insect. They can provide food in the form of lots of additional pollen, because that's very nutritious, lots of food, or they can provide nectar. They can have attractive colors and patterns to get the correct host to transfer the pollen, and their flower structure can also ensure that if they're providing food like nectar, the animal, insect or bat or bird, whatever is pollinating, actually comes in contact with the pollen and transfers the pollen. And you can see a lot more about this in the video that's online. It's the Sexual Encounters of the Floral Kind video, and you guys can watch that to see examples of all these different types of coevolutions between flowers and animals. An additional benefit that you see in flowering plants is they have something called double fertilization, which means that when pollen is produced and finds a stigma, lands on it, and grows that pollen tube down into the ovary, it produces 2 sperm cells. One of those sperm cells, when it reaches the embryo, is actually going to fertilize the egg, and then that will form the offspring. And the other sperm cells are going to fertilize the endosperm. And then the endosperm starts growing and provides that carbohydrate or nutrition. Kind of an equivalent would be if In humans, there were always twins, but then one twin would eat the other in utero for nutrition. So it's kind of creepy when you relate it to humans, but that's what happens with our flowering plant seeds. One embryo gets fertilized, and then the endosperm gets fertilized as well. Flowering plants have an advantage as well to distribute their offspring, or get the offspring away from the parent plant. Because they're all rooted to the ground, the parent doesn't want to outcompete its offspring. It also doesn't want to compete with them. So getting the seeds far away from the parent is beneficial to both parent and offspring. Plants do this by using fruits. There are different types of fruits. There's dry fruits and there's fleshy fruits, and they have a variety of mechanisms to get them away from the parent plant. So some fruits are spiky and can hitch a ride, so this poor puppy's got all sorts of plant material containing seeds stuck to his face, and as it brushes past these plants, it picks it up, scrapes it off later, and distributes the seeds. Another type of dry fruit can also use wind to blow the seeds away from the parent. Fleshy fruits provide a food source, and the plant wants you to eat the fruit. Because you eat the fruit along with the seeds, you move away from the parent plant. Those seeds will travel through your digestive system and be excreted along with some nice fertilizer for the offspring, so the baby plants. There are also some kind of interesting things. Plants want you to eat the fruit, but they also want to protect their seeds. This is why peppers to humans taste hot. So if you've ever bit on a pepper seed, a really hot pepper seed, you'll probably understand this effect. Well, birds actually can't sense that. They don't have, I guess, the receptors in their mouth to detect that hot pepper. However, mammals have that receptor in their mouth, so they detect it. The reason that birds don't detect it is that when birds eat the seeds of peppers, those seeds travel through the digestive system of the bird and are not damaged. And so the bird can fly away and drop the seed someplace else, and the plant can grow. If mammals eat the peppers, our digestive system is a bit harsher, and so it actually destroys the pepper seeds. So the pepper plant doesn't want mammals eating its seeds because the seeds won't survive that process. So they have a chemical to try to prevent mammals from eating it. Just we like the hot pepper flavor. Also, some seeds are poisonous. So apples and cherries are deadly poisonous. They have cyanide inside the seeds. So this is why you should not eat apple seeds, especially in very large quantities. Accidentally swallowing a couple is fine. But if you eat a lot of apple seeds, you could actually get a toxic dose of cyanide. Same thing with cherry pits. So this is something, if you have, I know, parakeets or other pet birds, you don't want to feed them apples with the seeds. So if the bird eats those, it can actually die from that cyanide in the apple seeds. So this is the progression again of plants from non-vascular to developing vascular tissue to transport water and nutrients. The development of seeds, either naked seeds in the gymnosperm or flowering plants which produce a fruit to surround the seed. Here is an overview of the life stages. Again, the non-vascular and the vascular plants have fully separate haploid and diploid stages that grow into multicellular structures. Gymnosperms and angiosperms, however, that haploid stage stays as a single cell and is fertilized and grows into the embryo. All plants also have to protect themselves from predation, so all the different types of plants. They may have a variety of structures, so you can see some nice thorns here, this peeling bark that will peel off and remove any insects along with it. They can produce secretions, so a variety of saps that will actually capture any insects that might be trying to feed on the plant. Also, there's a lot of chemicals that are produced by plants to keep insects and other organisms from eating the plant. And this is actually a huge business. There's something called bioprospecting, where companies look at plant chemicals to figure out if there's any human use or application of those plant chemicals. Also, for most plants, they're either parasitic or autotrophic, but some plants are carnivorous. There are about 600 carnivorous plants that will eat insects. So insects are attracted to the plant, planning to eat the plant or expecting nectar or some sort of reward, but instead, as a protection for the plant and also as nutrition, those pools that look like nectar actually poison and it kills the insect, and then it's digested by the plant. So that's another way they protect themselves in addition to eating. Moving on from plants to look at fungus. Now, if you look at this tree here, the fungus are actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants, and we'll see that as we move through here. Fungus includes mushrooms, molds, and yeast, and all of these are multicellular. They're also sessile, which means they're rooted to the spot. They don't move in the adult stages, so they're stuck in one location. And they're decomposers. So sorry that was cut off. So they're decomposers. Again, they're more closely related to animals. One of the characteristics that makes them more closely related to animals is the composition of their cell wall. So if you remember from way back in a previous chapter when we talked about the cell walls of plants, so plants, their cell wall is formed of cellulose. Well, in fungus, their cell wall is formed of chitin, and chitin is also found in some types of animals. In particular, chitin is what makes up the exoskeleton of arthropods, so insects. So if you ever stepped on a really big cockroach or other bug that went crush as you stepped on it, that crushing sound is their exoskeleton snapping, and that's composed of chitin. So the same structure surrounding all the cells of a fungus and surrounding the body of a cockroach or other insect are at the molecular level exactly the same. The difference is in the thicknesses of those layers. A little bit more about fungus. Their body is made of hyphae, and most of the body is under the surface. So here's the surface of the soil, or maybe rotting log, or whatever this fungus is growing in. These long filamentous strands in that substrate, that's the body of the mushroom. So that's the hyphae, and you get enough hyphae packed together and it forms what's called a mycelium. So that's mycelium is just hyphae all packed together. The part that we recognize as a mushroom, the part coming up out of the rotting log or the soil, is just a reproductive structure. It's formed from different mating types of hyphae growing together, and then they grow out and form this structure. And again, that's just composed of tightly woven hyphae. On the underside of the cap here, they're going to produce spores between those mating types, and those spores then can be released to grow into new offspring. Another thing about all of the fungus is they have external digestion. So to eat, what they do is secrete chemicals into their environment and dissolves anything surrounding them. So matter in the soil or the tree that's fallen, it will dissolve that and then absorb the nutrients directly. Fungus are also the largest recorded organism on Earth, and that happens to be the yellow honey mushroom in Oregon. It covers 4 square miles, but it's underneath the surface, so you don't see it. It's underneath a forest, actually, and what they did to determine that this was all the same organism is they would take samples around the forest, and they kept sampling and testing genetically. So they just do genetic analysis, and it was all the same mushroom, and they were able to actually find the edges or borders of that particular living organism, and it was irregular, but it covered about 4 square miles. Also, looking at the fact that this was all one organism, they estimated that it had to be 2,400 to as much as 8,000 years old based on how fast that particular type of fungus could grow. One more type of fungus I want to talk about is called mycorrhizae. And mycorrhizae are actually a beneficial type of fungus, so they have a symbiotic relationship with plants. Symbiotic means that both partners will benefit in the relationship. So the plant benefits, but then so does the mycorrhizae or the fungus. There's two types of mycorrhizae. There's ectomycorrhizae that just grows around the root hairs and stays on the outside of the cells. Endomycorrhizae, however, will actually grow right into the cell and have a direct connection to the inside of the cell. Both of these, what they do is they completely wrap the root hairs and they grow out away from the tree. So if you look at any plant or tree, it has about the same amount of root structure underneath as it does tree up above. And that's actually not far enough of a reach for this tree to get all of the water and nutrients and other things it needs. And so it has this association with the fungus, which can grow out much further away from the tree in all directions, and it will then transport any waters, minerals, things like that back to the tree for the tree to use, and the tree produces sugars from photosynthesis that it then shares with the fungus. So they both benefit from this relationship. In fact, many plants, if it doesn't have the associated mycorrhizae, they simply can't grow. They start dying off. If you've ever heard of acid rain killing forests, well, it can damage trees. So acid rain can do direct damage to the trees and leaves and things like that. But what really happens is that acid rain hits the ground and absorbs into the soil, and that changes the environment, makes it too acidic for the mycorrhizae. The mycorrhizae starts dying off, so now we don't have any mycorrhizae, and the tree can't support itself without being fed and provided with minerals and water by the mycorrhizae, so then the trees start dying off after that. So these mycorrhizae are very important. Some plants have actually taken advantage of that, and this particular plant is white because it doesn't use photosynthesis anymore. Instead, it forms a relationship with mycorrhizae and just feeds off of the fungus without giving anything back. So it's a parasite now to the fungus.